This conference will now be recorded. This conference will now be recorded.
There we go. Okay, this is a briefing to help us all understand the context for our Kaizen A3 workshop on Friday. And the goal is so that you can all focus on doing the work on Friday and not on getting caught up on some of the concepts. And you really should know, where we're coming from, why we're working, on this particular claim. What do we mean when you say waste? Is it it's not a sinful thing, it's just a part of how we do work. And also the background that's leading us up to this question of doing of whether or not we should be working on some kind of standardization of applications or standardization of project description for the purposes of reducing waste. So I'm going to cover each of these topics in a quick succession, and then the goal is to introduce all the ideas that we'll be wrestling with on Friday, but not to necessarily exhaustively review every topic. So let's see here. So first thing, the Kaizen project. This work really started in 2014 with a project called Coordinated Investment. It was refined in 2016 with a proposal that came from Snohomish County, was brought to the Ecosystem Coordination Board. And then ultimately, the ECB suggested that we explore how to integrate continuous improvement or Kaizen principles into Puget Sound recovery, and specifically within what we've been calling the coordination community. And these are staff that work for lead entities, local integrating organizations, Puget Sound Partnership Ecosystem Recovery Coordinators, Marine Resource Committee coordinators. I counted 41 staff across Puget Sound that are coordinating recovery activities through boards or committees or other such things. So the concept of Kaizen really comes out of post-war Japan. It sort of gained prominence during the sort of internationalization of the Toyota production system. So this is a manufacturing concept. In order to apply these ideas to Puget Sound recovery, we need to sort of add some extra reference points, sort of change how we think about what we do, perhaps. The main concept, I think, is that there is this place in this philosophy called Gemba, and that's the place where the value is created. And that place is not at your desk. That restoration or protection, although protection can occur through a written activity, but really it's restoration and protection happens on the ground. And everything else is enabling or empowering or funding or allowing that work to happen. But the value, the thing that we're trying to create is this change in ecosystem state. And we're, in theory, providing that value to our customer. In this case, it's the public or the representatives of the public that are, employing us to do work on behalf of the state or the nation or the county or whomever. And ultimately, though, the challenge is that there are often conflicting values around how to do natural resource management. And so we need some kind of clarity. And usually we have some kind of construct, which is our management, that doesn't really create value itself, but it does do two really important things in the sort of Kaizen worldview. One is clarifying objectives, so we know what we're doing and why and where, and also reducing constraints, making it easy for the people that are on the ground to get the work done. So this is, again, it's a manufacturing view of the universe. It doesn't translate perfectly, but it's important to sort of understand the ideas of the role of management, the importance of the place where the work happens, and in understanding what the people that do the work need in order to increase our production of value. So not all of our problems fit particularly well into this model, and in particular, there are a lot of cases where in our work in governments trying to do ecosystem management, there are sort of unresolved conflicts that are not under direct agency control. Maybe there's a mixture of sort of local cultural issues or political conflicts. These problems are ones that are not well treated by Kaizen. However, there are a wide range of challenges we face that where all the tools are in the control of our various agencies, where any inefficiencies or our inability to do the work is, a matter of unintended consequences, things that we have created, but that don't serve us well. And so these are what I would call these are production problems, and these are things that we can solve together. And they're often created because our production system is constructed and managed by lots of different people. So our little team, that's Kit Crump, Laura Ferguson, Marta Green, and myself, took on this challenge to try and stand up some kind of prototype for how we would try out this way of thinking to try and improve our interagency natural resource management system, focusing on sort of our production strategies. And so we sort of came up and are working off of a pretty standard sequence. And the neat thing about borrowing Kaizen or lean management or A3 process or whatever you want to call it, is that there's lots of precedent out there. There's lots of tools out there. These are sort of frequently practiced and well-studied processes, and it gives us a toolkit to work from. But really, if I could summarize what we're proposing, what we've been doing, what we're hoping to propose in the future, is there are several steps. At first, we're soliciting claims of waste, and I'll define that later, and we're collecting them from the field. So we're going to the ecosystem, field practice and saying, what is getting in your way? Where are you wasting effort? Important step of the puzzle is we are remembering and sorting claims. We have a list of all the claims we've collected over time. Then our next goal is to empower some kind of facilitator to pursue a claim. And these are somehow we have to figure out who's going to do the work of trying to figure out what the solution to waste is, because it's not always simple. Because if you have to understand why we do things the way we do well enough to be able to change it. Finally, we are in this step right now as we're getting ready to do what we call an A3 process. We're pulling together a focus group. We've done some interviews, and we're looking at a particular claim that I'll talk about in a little bit in order to try and turn it from just a claim into a well-understood problem and solution. And then ultimately, there's the process of implementing, and that may take funding. It'll take resources from somewhere. It could be existing staff in agencies. It could be existing staff from the field. It could be funding augmenting a grant. It could be a special application through the action agenda or some other process. But our goal is to find as many mechanisms as possible so that improvement becomes just a standard part of our business practices. Okay, any clarifying thoughts or questions about Kaizen? That is the 3-slide version of what we're trying to do, which is create a continuous improvement process by working on claims of waste while avoiding the politically sticky stuff so that we can free up labor and free up our ability to focus on those bigger challenges by removing the barriers and the challenges that we've created for ourselves. There we go. Any thoughts, questions about those last couple slides? Alrighty. And also at the end, if you have anything that comes up, we can have a longer chat if you want to stick around. Okay. The next thing I wanted to talk about was the funding system. And so for our initial workshop and our initial work, we chose to focus on the funding system, even though there were twice as many claims of waste around the regulatory system. And that's because our hypothesis is that the funding system may actually be sort of what I'd call the engine of Kaizen. It has a broader mandate. There's resources in our funding system to make improvements and solve procedural problems. There's more flexible resources that can be used for improvement. And ultimately, the funding system is what pays for any regulatory waste. So if it takes twice as long to solve a permitting problem, that gets paid for through the funding system. And so ultimately, we imagine that the funding system will become an engine for improvement on the regulatory side as well. Now, while some funding programs are more complicated than other funding programs, from the perspective of the funding program, pretty much all the work is shockingly similar from program to program. Ideally, there's some kind of planning process that tells us, what's the right action and what's the right place to do the work. Then there is a proposal and review process, by which we evaluate an offer to go do some work. That culminates in some kind of decision to allocate resources among all the potential proposals. And then on the back end, there's some kind of contracting and reporting process, on the back side of the funding system. So from sort of an individual program perspective, it's a simple, straightforward, repetitive process. In reality, however, very few projects are completed with a single funding resource. As our projects become larger, more ambitious, more entwined with infrastructure, with acquisition that's complicated, this becomes more and more true that a project requires multiple funding sources. And so this is a case study in South Puget Sound. Some colleagues put together. Here's the acquisition phase, took at least 3 grants. Then this is the design phase, took 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 grants. And the last 2 grants that were finishing up design became the bulk of construction, but then they didn't have all the money they needed for construction, so they had to get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, so 9 grants to complete construction. This was a $6.4 million project, a total of 16 grants, started in 2002. And this really sort of pushed this shop to their limits of being able to manage. And so this is an example of how the funding system actually operates on the ground in its sort of full implementation. And so really what we end up with is a funding system where the plan might not be entirely clear, what the program is trying to achieve and where and with what. There's often this cyclic process of proposal and review that happens over and over again and over and over again as you sort of try and work through the grant process, and every couple of years the grants start to run out. And then that results ultimately in this potentially this cumulative administrative burden through contracting and reporting, as each grant requires its own reporting pathway. The particularly poignant part of this overall funding system sort of storyline is that there is a body of evidence that this local project management, the people that are writing the grants and developing the projects and trying to implement the projects, may really be a limiting factor on our rate of ecosystem recovery. I think that the money is an important issue, but in some places, the reason why new projects aren't getting queued up is because there's not enough local staff capacity to get those projects lined up or to work on problems or to get through this stuff. So it seems like this might be an important piece of the overall ecosystem recovery process. Any clarifying thoughts or questions about the funding system, its problems, and why we're starting with the funding system as we try and do this improvement work?
So, Paul, you mentioned that you've got a number of different claims of waste, and they come in different buckets. There's funding complaints, and then there's regulatory complaints. So this is a particular complaint that you've received, like on the website or something. Where is that kind of the origin? Is it you get a bunch of different complaints about this system just isn't working?
Yeah, so we this idea that we're pursuing on Friday is really, in some ways, and I'll talk about a little bit more in the next couple sections, was identified when I did workshops and interviews in Snohomish County as an issue. It was also identified independently by a group of program managers who got together and asked, how can we better run our grant programs together? And then Kit and Marta and Laura and myself, after we received a bunch of new complaints, sort of lined them all up, applied some criteria, just the four of us, and sort of did a ranking process. And this one sort of also topped the list as well. So this idea of having a standard or some kind of standard project description or standard application process to reduce some of the negative effects in the funding system stood out for us. So it's a little arbitrary. We could do a better, more thorough, complete, exhaustive, ranking process, but it came up enough that it felt like it was, I think, I would say good enough for now and safe enough to try. And there's also was a group in particular, the Align Grant Coordination Work Group, co-sponsored by Ecology and RCO, that was standing up and ready to work on improvement. And so it seemed like a potential good relationship to build between a group of funding program managers and a field of people writing grants. It seemed like a great opportunity to experiment with this Kaizen model because all the groups necessary were sort of already in position. If that makes sense.
Yes.
Yep, so that's an important question, I think, that we should, as we think about sort of the Kaizen process, is how do we pick what to work on next? And my inclination personally, and this is something that I'm sure will be debated on our team and debated farther down the road as we bring ideas to groups like the Ecosystem Coordination Board, is that we should apply effort to making improvements where there is enough motive to do something. Oftentimes we spend a lot of time discussing and ranking and rating possibilities, and then not very much happens afterwards. So at this point, I would say where there's energy to make substantial improvements and there's someone there to lead the charge and can convince others that it's important, I would say that's worth going with. But that's just my personal opinion on this front. Anything else before we jump into what's waste? I wanted to throw this in here because waste sounds like such a negative word when it comes out of my mouth. That's why I say waste a lot, because I'm trying to desensitize myself and others to the idea that waste is real, that waste exists, that waste is almost unavoidable. In fact, in many cases, waste is necessary from a production perspective. We do lots of things just to sort of build shared understanding and consensus that from, if you were just interested in, the shiny car rolling off the end of the lot, that would be considered waste. So waste is always present, and it's our challenge to manage waste. And so if we don't talk about it, if we don't understand it, if we don't define it, then it really compromises our ability to do systems improvement. That's what I really appreciate about the production perspective, is not because it's some kind of a theological position, but rather that it gives us tools to deal with something that is both unavoidable and compromises our effectiveness. So the neat thing again is because Kaizen comes with some definitions of waste that we can actually use. So very simply, in this context, waste is effort that we spend that doesn't create value. And so then, of course, the question is, well, what do we mean by effort? What do we mean by value? And so I think that's where it takes some adjustment to think about what is this? What is our manufacturing system? What are we making? Who is our customer? And how do we make that thing of value? Here's my proposition in order to make sense of this territory. Is that the value that we create are ecosystems that provide services, or ecosystem services. That we each do it in different ways. Some of us are focused on the fish, some of us are focused on beneficial use of water, others have other issues that they're concerned about. But ultimately, all of those different values coincide in ecosystems and depend on those ecosystems for their production. So that's what we do, is we actually are either protecting or restoring. In terms of customer, I've had some really interesting discussions with different people about this idea of customer. And although, it may be the fish themselves, it may be future generations, but in sort of the most proximate sense, who we're working for, who buys our product, it's really the citizens and their representatives of those citizens that have that fund our programs, to a greater or lesser extent, either nationally, statewide, or within a municipality, or even within a tribe. So in terms of where we ultimately, who we provide services to, who we have to talk to understand their values, we ultimately have to go back to citizens and representatives. And then also there's an assumption that I make, is that we are all elements of a single production system. And that this production system, that we don't do this work independently. We're part of an interdependent network, and that network goes beyond our personal institutions. So NOAA does very little salmon recovery. We move resources and information around, but salmon recovery is actually accomplished by tribes and conservation districts and counties and cities and NGOs. And that's who actually creates the value. We're just enablers of that. And so it would be ridiculous for NOAA to think of itself as an independent producer of value. Rather, we depend on a whole nother system in order to realize our mission. So if we don't have some clarity around these things, then the how we do Kaizen, how we evaluate improvement, becomes much harder. And so with these things in place, though, we really can talk about producing the best product, using the least resources, and ultimately, as the Japanese Kaizen folks would say, and make everyone else nervous, searching for perfect production. So if we have our eye on this, we really know what we're producing, and we really know what our resource base is, then we can really start thinking about how do we get as much value out of what we have in hand as possible. So the Kaizen folks have a whole bunch of stuff. I'm not going to go through all of these, but these are all different language to describe different kinds of waste. And so that if you are trying to produce and you're constantly sort of stopping and starting and hurrying up and slowing down, that process creates an unevenness, which creates waste. And I'm sure project managers have experienced this. If you try and overburden one part of a system, and try and make it do more than it can, that can create waste too. If you kind of stuff everything through one part of the process all at once, all at the same time. So creating this evenness of production actually has a lot of value, and there's been a lot of analysis thinking about that. And there's all kinds of other kinds of waste, whether it's people that either you're producing more than you need at the moment, and then it has to become inventory, and then you have to manage that, pick it up again, put it down again. Could be planning fits into this somewhat, waiting for resources when you're ready to go, too much sort of movement or transportation of how many touches does a regulatory application get? Does it have to get handed back and forth 20 times or 10 times? And there's all kinds of other kinds of waste, and it's useful to think about these and try and translate them into our industry. In fact, I think it would be an interesting exercise, and we'll be doing some of this on Friday, is getting clearer about where waste is occurring in the context of the application process. Any thoughts or questions about waste, not as a sin, but as a necessary thing to manage and figure out how to work with?
Hi, Paul. This is Kathleen. Could you give maybe another example in the world of granting of how this waste flowchart might apply?
I think we'll get into it a little bit. I think when in the next couple of slides, and in particular around when we looked at we'll look again at that budget spreadsheet that was for the Prairie Creek project. And I think you could see a number of examples of where waste might occur. For example, I'm just going to pick up a pet one that seems to be coming up over and over again that I think is down the road for us a little bit is matching. So the process of filling out financial paperwork to show that this receipt for this service matches that receipt for that service across a network of 5 or 6 or 10 grants. You have to ask what exactly is the value that is created there. And there's something about public accountability, something about showing that there's multiple stakeholders involved in a process. There's something about sort of local skin in the game. There's a variety of sort of ideas, vague ideas behind what matching exactly does. And then at the end of the day, you have to wonder if the administrative workload that we've created around matching is commensurate with the value we're getting, and if there would be another way to achieve the value of matching that would be more efficient. Does that sound like a good one?
Yeah, thanks.
I think for the next one, I think I'm going to pass this one off to Kit. Is my timing right?
You are timing right.
Say ding, and I'll push the button.
Ding.
Let's see.
All right, perfect. So one of the things we've noticed in various times when folks have looked at this is, although there's tons of different applications out there, there's a lot of the basic question themes that come up over and over again, especially at the bottom of the chart as you work below it. There's almost always, because the community needs to be part of these, defining the community support for your project, the community benefits, regardless if it's a water quality project, salmon project, or marine resource project, the technical detail about what you're doing. And then as you get closer to the actual approach, the technical detail, probably kind of a transition, the reliability and importance, it starts to become very program dependent. Are you doing a water quality project? And if so, how does it affect a noted TMDL in a high priority watershed? Same with salmon recovery and other types of grant activities. But really, we started to see that you could, in many ways, create a kind of a standard application, because 60 to 80% of it's the same basic type of questions with a little bit of tweaking, and then you're really spending most of your time going to a separate portion of the application or portal to explain the importance and kind of your technical approach to it and your team's credibility in doing that work. And so what you see when you go through these multiple funding streams is you have multiple application cycles, multiple reviews. One thing that Paul didn't mention that I've found even more insidious than what might have been implied by the Prairie Creek thing is there's almost an implication with that slide that, well, those are discrete buckets of money, so I need to apply to the precise number of buckets to make my project whole. And that would be true if you were the only one applying. Unfortunately, it's 16 different competitive rounds. So what makes the review much more difficult to engage in is someone's budget is actually hedge betting. They're like, well, I don't know if I'm going to get any of this money, so I have duplicates in some of these budgets. So how would funders ever get together and make a more coordinated review? And there's a segue for that later when we get into standard budgeting for different programs. But you can see there's different awards coming at different times, with different requirements, different contract language, sometimes vastly different reporting requirements. And then finally, at the end, your value is realized. So just from looking at this, you're like, how could you possibly make this less cumbersome without having the miracle of having more funding in one location? So I'm forgetting the exact point of this so much, is that this is really the next kind of phase of things, is that once you get an award, you are stuck with kind of large scale reporting requirements and large scale contract requirements. So I would basically say what this slide says to me is that the waste amplifies as you go through this, because then all of a sudden you are getting farther into the weeds on the kind of late stage portion of the process. And it's only when you're actually kind of constructing one project, designing one project, that you're back in the harmony of a single effort to manage.
Thanks, Kat. There's, the other question that I always wonder is there an opportunity to sort of reduce the application effort? Is there an opportunity to reduce the review effort in this process? And that's really, I think, what is going to be the meat of our Friday discussion. Any sort of thoughts, questions about this idea of standardizing project description or application? Or why we think it might be a problem? Okay.
And I guess I would note that there is such a thing on the regulatory side of things, that a lot of people said, well, there's no way you could have one application process for something as different as a hydraulic project approval or an Army Corps permit, but yet it does in fact exist. So we're hoping that there is a precedent for this and we can actually get traction on this idea.
Okay. So I did want to say that this, sorry?
Yeah, well, and there might be some good lessons learned from the JARPA process too. Just the intention was to create, so you didn't have to keep putting the same information in a bunch of different applications. There was a hope that you'd also get concurrent review, so you'd get speedier processes. So doing some evaluation of how well that's worked might be some lessons learned as well.
Yeah. And there's a, and it ultimately, I think there's a difference between creating interesting policy and actually deploying that policy effectively into multiple institutions. So I think that the idea of a standard is not, it's actually it's a very specific process in the Kaizen world. Is if you run into a source of waste, the first question is there a standard or not? Because if what they mean when they say is there a standard is there a regular way of doing routine work? Have you investigated and come up with an approach for doing something routine, like writing up a project that is, it tries to achieve efficiency? And if there is no standard, what that means is that each time someone does the process, they're making it up. And that each reviewer is making it up, each applicant's making it up. It's constant, this constant innovation, and it becomes very difficult to reduce waste. It's systematically to try and organize the work so that you're using less effort to achieve a greater benefit. And so really I'm finding myself, as I do this process over and over again, I find myself increasingly saying, first question, is there a standard? If not, let's try and create a standard so that then we can start improving from there. That you can't really improve until you have a standard to improve upon. So that's, I think, our challenge here in some ways. This idea that the standard application project didn't come out of nowhere. There's actually been the first pilot project that we started up in doing this kind of improvement process was to try and develop some standard budget language. And that's because when we were looking at project descriptions, really the heart of a project is the budget. Everything else is describing and justifying the budget. And so if we could get to some standards around budget, that might really set us up to be able to gain some efficiencies in the contracting and application and all the spin-off processes that spin off of budget. So the language around budget is really important, and that's why we picked it for an initial project. So back to the sheet, now in blue because of my fastidious color coordination. This is actually a template that didn't exist for the Prairie Creek project until we pulled together some administrative money and gave it to a project applicant in order to dissect and better understand their project, their big cumbersome project, and then compare that with other project developers who are also developing big projects. So this is actually a template for a standard budget structure that tries to integrate the budget federal and state requirements across multiple grant programs, from RCO salmon money to ESRP to floodplains by design, and so on and so forth, with the goal of trying to develop standard language and wording so that you can chop up a project in a consistent way. Within this single standard, and it's in a draft form, it's being passed around. I heard the term I like the most that I've just started hearing recently is it's being socialized. We're taking this out and sharing it with people and seeing what they think of it. But it basically chops up a project into standard phases. It starts defining some standards for tasks and budget elements common to projects, including acquisition. Part of the breakdown is by federal object class, so that then you can re-roll it up into a federal application or a state application. And then for each column, you have different funding sources. And so really what this does is it sets us up so an application then is a block of numbers, and that you can use this block of numbers and to create an application for, or you could just submit the whole darn budget and just highlight these cells and say, this application is for these cells. And then you don't have to redo your budget every time you're coming up with a new grant. So this is a sort of a preliminary work. I'm hoping that Kristen Marshall at South Sound Salmon Enhancement Group is going to be able to join us on Friday to be able to represent this work so far. But it's a platform that we can step from as we think about how to get to standard application. The advantages is that it's not intended to be a static budget, but rather it's a dynamic budget that changes over time. It increases transparency, which has potential unintended consequences that we need to think about and talk about. However, what it lets you do is if you need to change your contracts, you can adjust one budget and get multiple approvals, and you're not having to do as much work to go back through contracts and figure out how you divided up the project among multiple contracts, because it's all represented in a single budget. In addition, the referencing of the similar tasks and having the tasks broken out clearly really could lead to improvements in contracting and reporting, so that there are not separate tasks on every contract. And then finally, this may also offer us a more efficient way to audit match, because the match intent could probably be achieved through multiple mechanisms. Here you have a project that has 16 funding sources. The idea that you should go through and prove the match through comparing receipts seems to be a little inefficient, for achieving the intended match. So again, it gives us a platform to start building off of as we think about standardizing applications and then standardizing reporting and contracting and on from there. Any clarifying thoughts or questions about the budget standard project? Our goal is to have a alternative budget format available for multiple funding sources for the 2020 project development season, so that if early adopters can work with our folks and work with grant programs and have a single budget structure for multiple funding sources.
Paul, this is Kathleen. I have a question about that. So is your goal that you envision that if you create the standard budget, then those folks applying for grants can start using it? Or is your goal that you have the variety of local, state, and federal agencies adopt this as something that is approved, I guess? Or, I mean, maybe that's a bit of a stretch, but that they're supportive of using this?
Yeah, it's both. So we are actively working through the details. It's a lot of shuttle diplomacy back and forth between project developers on one side and the grant program managers on the other. But if the biggest challenge is RCO, state salmon and PAC-SURF salmon. For folks that have filled out gone through that budget process, it's probably the most rigorous in terms of identifying every rock and stick that you put on the ground. And other programs don't have that same level of itemization. So I think a lot of it is trying to still serve the RCO salmon system while having it be able to be used in many other different systems. So what I'm anticipating, this is, knock on wood, fingers crossed, is to have a range of programs officially adopt this budget format as optional and provide instruction for how you would use this budget to fulfill the requirements of that grant program. So it would be actually it would be an option for budget delivery to, for example, ESRP or floodplains by design or PSAR or RCO salmon, or maybe a few others if we can pull it off. And that because it uses these object classes, it would also be able to roll up through a very simple process into a federal application as well.
Okay, so that was my question, is do you see it being useful for EPA, NEP, Puget Sound Partnership Action Agenda, and MRC grants?
So the Puget Sound, we are in that aligned group, and we are having conversations with the Habitat SIL in particular. We haven't reached out across all the SILs. I have a pre-briefing that I'm trying to schedule with the federal caucus co-leads, which includes Peter Murchie at the NEP program. So we do have those particular funding sources in our sights. Ultimately, the federal contracts are, it depends if it's a pass-through or if it's actually a federal contract. So in terms of what format you'd have to use. I don't know if that helps or not, or if I can be more precise.
No, that's good. I was kind of curious and thinking about application for grants that we receive here at the county beyond just the RCO salmon grants.
Yeah, I mean, our goal is to get a critical mass working well and avoid if there is some kind of a conflict that makes it hard, then to sort of try and build a critical mass around a range of funding sources and then build from that. However, I think that, I mean, really having worked in probably like 2 or 3 different grant programs, there's so much similarity and there's so little real reason for the differences. Okay. Anything before jumping into our last little bitty presentation? Thank you guys for the marathon and sticking with it. Our goal on Friday is to initiate an A3 process on the standard application question. The standard budget is an initial iteration is rolling out. I think that standard budget work will feed into some of our standard application questions, but I would like to be able to bring back our Kaizen project proposal with an example of some next steps that we could do, and also to make good use of that Align grant coordination group while they have energy to do work in time for the 2020 project season. So, and to try and learn from the 2020 season, and then that sets the stage for our some kind of standard application process in the future. The process we're going to use, and this is back to the fact that we're working from the Kaizen handbook, is what we're calling an A3 process. A3 simply refers to an international paper size. It's basically the equivalent to an American 11 by 17 sheet of paper. And the reason that is used is because it suggests that the ability to define a problem and a solution should be able to fit on an 11 by 17 sheet of paper. And it's important to make it fit because it shows that you have clarity, and it also allows lots of different people to very quickly and efficiently understand the claim of waste and how we can fix it, and then come to consensus. So if you have to produce a huge long report that half the people that ever see it skim it, and then half of those actually read it, and then often it's difficult to adjust or to incorporate ideas because it's so complicated. Saying, if you're going to solve a problem, fit it onto an 11 by 17 sheet of paper. And so that's going to be our goal on Friday. The interesting thing about this is transparency, this clarity that comes from having an A3 process is really important in our situation, because we have to come up with solutions that cross institutional stovepipes. That, you know, within each of our institutions, we have very strong command and control systems. But we have very weak mechanisms for controlling behavior across state and local and federal systems, or even within the federal system. You know, NOAA doesn't control the Army Corps. The Army Corps doesn't control NOAA. And so in order to build a shared understanding, you have to really develop agreements and understanding rather than trying to assert control, particularly in this improvement context. And so in order to find agreement, you have to understand the needs of all the parties. You can't just blame someone for waste and expect that they're going to go fix it. And so that then requires also that we maybe let go of some of our preferences, you know, focus on our needs, the things that we really need to create value to serve our customer, and then try and sort of find those things that are going to really work well, while at the same time trying to maintain a high level of honesty about what is it that we really need, and to not get in a tug of war over preferences. So that's really what the A3 process is intended to do, is to help us sort of sort through and get down to needs, ask questions, but do it through this sort of shuttle diplomacy process, all fitting onto an 11 by 17 sheet of paper. So, you know, sort of in summary, there is a process that we're going to go through, which is we've collected the claims. We're going to try and figure out what's the value that we're creating through an application process. You know, what is the current condition of the application system? Where is waste being created? Why do we do it that way? What's the underlying root cause as to why we do our grant system this way? And get some clarity from our various leaderships, whether it's within an agency or a more public environment like ECB, that this is something worth working on. And then it's a matter of really, that's not the end of it, but in taking this, this definition of where we want to go and walking it through a variety of different places, whether it's you guys as applicants, whether it's the people that are actually administering RFPs. Some of this has to do with legislative intent. Some of this might interact with local versus regional strategy. And so ultimately, we make sure that our solution doesn't create more problems. And we're looking for voluntary solutions. We're looking for clarity from leadership. And we're actually doing a design process, paying attention to the design environment in order to get to a solution that then is much easier to implement. Because in theory, it solves problems carefully and incrementally. Ultimately, we're going to be working with a product that will look something like this. This is an example of an A3 format, and it could be that, you know, a number of different ways to play it out. But ultimately, you're trying to understand what's the claim of waste, you know, why, what is the current system. We have to understand, you know, where the waste is occurring, but that's not always enough. We really need to understand the root causes and why it is that the system is the way it is, so that then you can come up with a solution that digs deeper and tries to figure out how do we create the same value with a more efficient system. There's lots of sort of implications in how we do a competitive, peer-reviewed applications that may be driving us, and we may find other ways to solve those problems. And that's sort of the opportunity of an A3 process, is to dig in and figure out, are there other alternatives that would allow us to achieve these benefits. And then ultimately, you know, that turns into some kind of proposal that gets walked around. You maybe go back and forth and you refine that proposal over time, but the trick is to not drop the ball. And that ultimately there's an action plan that tells who and what and where and how it happens. And this becomes a mechanism And it doesn't necessarily have to be from within the grant programs. For example, we're getting some really good progress on a coordinated budget, not by working within the grant programs, but by asking someone outside the grant program to come up with a better solution for us, because the grant programs are often blinded by their own sort of parochial understandings. And someone outside the grant program can see more clearly how all the different budgets align or don't align. But ultimately, we also have to hold ourselves accountable and verify that the thing we've created actually did what we thought it was going to do. So a lot of this is about remembering and institutionalizing improvement processes. The place we're thinking of doing this is the Ecosystem Coordination Board, because it is a very diverse board and they have accepted this as their role. In fact, the legislature wrote it into the authorizing legislation for the Puget Sound Partnership, that this is one of the functions of the Ecosystem Coordination Board. So we're simply trying to realize that benefit. Any questions about the A3 process, mechanisms and activities and workshop-y stuff that we're going to be working on Friday are still a little mysterious. We're still figuring them out. It'll be interesting and dynamic and fun. And hopefully with this background, it'll set us up to actually get to work and try and think about, what is this system? What are the sources of waste? Why is it the way it is? And what is it that we're trying to change about it specifically that is, a source of waste? So any questions about the A3 concept that we're going to be using to organize our work on Friday? Okay. Well, that's the context for the workshop. I hope this is useful. I mean, we really are trying to test a prototype. That's what the workshop is, partly about. We're building on, focusing on the funding system. We're going to be exploring different kinds of waste. I can share this presentation and the slides, and I'll send that out, probably close of business today. From budget, that's the best of the waste application, and then seeing what we come up with in terms of an A3, and then bringing that back to the ECB as a tool that we work with, and as a potential future direction to continue improvement processes. So thank you so much for tolerating a long presentation, and any final thoughts or questions before I stop the recording? All righty. Thank you so much.